Welcome to a presentation by the Australian Delphi Users Group that was shown at our 2023 Symposium. Our forums provide a resource where you can ask questions and receive answers about Delphi. There are many experienced Delphi users who watch our forum and provide helpful answers to your questions. You can also show your knowledge by answering questions that others may have. Attendees of the Symposium have access to a 2023 Symposium category, which is where you will find information related to this year's Symposium. This will include the videos, links, and content provided by the presenters. The Australian Delphi Users Group has regular local meetings in Melbourne, Sydney, Perth, Brisbane, and Adelaide. Many of these meetings can be watched online via Zoom. Watch the meetings category in the forums for announcements of upcoming meetings, information you need to know to go to them, and what topics are going to be discussed at the meeting. We would like to encourage everyone who is able to attend our meetings to learn and network and meet up with other developers like you. We are always looking for people to present topics, and we are sure there are many people watching who have unique expertise that others would be interested in knowing about. This year's presenters are Jeffrey Smith, Jason Tolley, John Asenden, and David Millington. We would like to thank our sponsors for supporting this year's Symposium. We would also like to thank our prize donors who have provided us with excellent prizes for attendees to win. Now, without any further ado, here is one of our Symposium presentations.
As the C++ product manager, but I also look after the IDE and a few other areas. You can see my email on screen there. Always feel free to drop me an email. You're always very welcome. And Twitter as well, although Twitter, of course, might be something to migrate off these days. Look, I'm going to run through writing ToolsAPI plugins from scratch. So we're first going to go through the concepts that you need to know and where to look for information and to find the your various interfaces and things that you need. Briefly cover what you can do, and then we'll use those just to make a very small empty plugin. It won't do very much, but we'll use those to make a plugin from scratch. Then after that, we'll look at what we added to the ToolsAPI recently in 11.3, a few tips and tricks and a wrap up and questions. So let's get started. Alrighty. So in terms of concepts that you need to know, Delphi and C++ Builder have supported plugins for many years. And in general, a plugin is just another package that's loaded into the IDE, exactly the same way that you load components into the IDE. In fact, when you have a special design time editor that's in the object inspector, for example, that is a type of plugin. So to create a plugin, it's quite simple. You just create a package and you link to Design IDE. And Design IDE is something that we provide that provides all your access to the IDE, basically, provides some of the symbols and so forth, which we'll look at later. And the package registers itself. If you're familiar with component development, then having a register method will be familiar to you. But if you're not, then basically when the IDE loads the package, it will look for a particular method called register and call it. And then in that, you will do whatever you need to do to let the IDE know about whatever it is.
Recording in progress.
To let the IDE know about whatever it is that you're trying to load into the IDE. Here, because we're talking plugins, the old terminology for a plugin was add-on or wizard. So we are registering a wizard with the IDE. The code snippet you can see on screen, register package wizard, and then you create something. The IDE will manage the lifetime of that. So you just create a class that implements a particular interface. We'll get to that one as well. And then the IDE will look after the lifetime of that for you. Generally, you have a singleton object that manages everything that your wizard does. But you don't have to. You can register multiple wizards, and there are actually multiple ways to register wizards, but register package wizard is the main one and the one we're going to use today. So in that code snippet, it called TIDE wizard.create, and so what was that? Now, register package wizard wants a particular interface, an IOTA wizard, And this is the most basic interface. It has a few methods simply to specify the name of the wizards, if it should be enabled in the IDE or not, and so forth. And everything that you want to do in the IDE, you will build on by either implementing other interfaces or querying the IDE for various interfaces that it implements. But an IOTA wizard is where it starts. So plugin development is heavily interface-based in two forms. So there are interfaces that the IDE provides and that you query for. For example, an interface representing a project or representing a module, which is your logical entry in a project, like a file, which could be a unit, or threads, for example. If you dig into the debugger APIs, then you'll be able to iterate the processes and threads and so forth, and all of those will be represented by interfaces. And you will query the IDE for those, or once you get an interfaced object to you and interface back from the IDE, then it will have properties and methods to get other interfaces. The other way is that there are various interfaces defined in the ToolsAPI that you implement, and then you provide those to the IDE. And that's where we return to the registered IOTA wizard, because that's the most basic example of that. So let's test this out, and we can create a completely empty plugin. So I have RAD Studio 11.3 running here, and as I said, plugin is a package, so let's just create a new Delphi package. Alrighty, and we need to add what it needs to link against. So we need design IDE. Oops, I misspelled that. That will now allow us to access what the IDE provides, and we should add the VCL as well. All right, we need to add some source code of some sort. That's always useful. All right, so we mentioned registering. So the source code that we just looked at, then we need to define that there is a method called register, which the IDE is going to call. And we need to implement that, so forth. And this is the code we just saw on screen: register package wizard TID wizard dot create. You can see Code Insight isn't very happy for a few reasons. So first of all, I need to add the ToolsAPI. Now, ToolsAPI.pas is the main ToolsAPI file. There are actually something like 40 different files that define a bunch of things to do with the ToolsAPI and the IDE that you can access. But the vast majority of things that you will want are in ToolsAPI.pas. So that's good. That's made Code Insight happy for register package wizard, but of course it's not happy about our TID wizard because we haven't declared or implemented that yet. So let's do that. Okay, I'll get to what tNotifier object is later, but it's a very minimal, small class that we define. The main thing here is that we are creating a class and we're implementing an interface, and this interface is defined in ToolsAPI.pas. Now, I mentioned that IOTA wizard was a very basic interface and just had a few different methods about name and state and so forth. So I've added those here. You can see an ID, a name, a state, and so forth. So let me complete those. Execute has no meaning currently. There's another interface that you can implement called IOTA menu wizard, and that will add a single menu item in the help menu. And when that single menu item is clicked, it will call the execute method. But for now, we really don't need to worry about that. What we do need to do is mention the ID and the name and the state. So I'll just fill those out. So the ID is something internal. It's never user visible. What we tend to see, and it's fairly good practice, is to just have some kind of dotted name, like your company or you dot something. But it really doesn't matter as long as it's unique. and I'll give it a friendly name here. And finally, the state. And in general, it would be very unlikely for your state to be anything other than enabled, but you can change that live if you need. Okay, and let's save this. Sorry for the extra time wasted by creating folders and so forth, but I think it's worthwhile for the sake of doing something completely from scratch. Alrighty, so we have that, and that's the most basic wizard that you have. Now, of course, it doesn't do anything yet, but let's just try and test it, and we can just right-click and install. The same as any other installable package like a component, and you can see it's been installed. Now, it won't do anything, but right now we already have a wizard loaded into the IDE. Now I'm going to uninstall that and go back to the slides. Okay. So back to sort of general concepts and things that you need to know. So we mentioned that there are interfaces that the IDE provides. Now there's a symbol called ball and IDE services, and as you can tell, this was first defined quite a while ago. Now that symbol is always available to your plugin when you link against Design IDE, and it implements a wide variety of interfaces. So to get started with basically anything, you will query ball and IDE services for a particular interface. And when you get that interface, you'll then move on from there. And this sort of root object provides access to the basic sort of root layers of everything in the IDE. Obviously, with some interfaces, you'll then go on and explore to property.property.property.property or something. But to get started, you always start with ball and IDE services, and it will give you an implementation of a wide variety of interfaces. So there's a code snippet on the screen there. IOTA message services is an interface that represents adding messages in the messages view. And so you query ball and IDE services if it's supported, which it will be, and then you can do things like add a message. There are a couple of minor exceptions to this. The first is the splash screen. So there's another symbol called splash screen services, and the reason that's provided separately is because that's available very early in startup or loading. And a couple of other methods and things that are defined in ToolsAPI paths that are useful, such as getActiveProject. But you can, of course, query ball and IDE services for various interfaces that will list the projects. You can get access to the project group and then iterate that to get access to the projects and so forth. It's worth just browsing through ToolsAPI to see what's available, basically. But the takeaway here is that, in general, query ball and IDE services for a particular interface. Okay, so let's test this out. Where are we? Okay, so I want to do some stuff when my wizard is created, and I'm going to add a message in the messages view, basically using the interface that I just showed you. All right, so let's add a constructor and destructor to your wizard singleton here, and I'm going to add basically the same code that we already saw. So we define a variable IOTA message of type IOTA message services, query if the ball and IDE services symbol implements that interface, which it does, and then we can call messages.addTitleMessage. There's a lot of methods that this interface that represents the messages view makes available, but that one just adds because the title is a message in bold. You can do all sorts of things. You can even add messages that you have full control of the painting over, for example. However, supports I need to add something to the user's clause. Alrighty. So this is an example of the kind of thing that you always do in your plugins. I'll put a breakpoint there so we can see when it's loaded. The other thing is I want to show the splash screen services. Now the way to do that is because that happens when the package is loaded. So we should do that in the initialization. Now this is going to be a bit hacky code. You should probably pull this out to a method and so forth, but I am just going to put some code in here that, so let me add VCL graphics to the users clause as well. Righty, so now we know about a t-bitmap. So in the initialization, what's this doing? It's creating a bitmap and loading it from a file. Now, in a real plugin, you would load it from a resource. You would compile it into your plugin itself as a resource and load it. I made this really fancy icon yesterday. I just saved it on my desktop, so we're just going to load that. And then we have the other symbol that ToolsAPI makes available, splash screen services. And this can be used to add anything to the splash screen. Normally you'd call add plugin bitmap, but there are a few other methods intended for products as well. Anyway, we're just going to add a bitmap, and we're going to give it a name. You would normally give the name of your plugin here, and an array of images. And I'm just going to pass in one image to this array, but the array of images is for high DPI, so that you can create various sizes of your logo or your icon, and the splash screen will choose the appropriate one when it's drawn. But I made a fairly large single bitmap, so I'm just going to pass in one, and it'll be scaled down automatically. All right, now, in the past, a few minutes ago, I just right-clicked and installed. But of course, if I do that now, then we won't see the splash screen because this instance of the IDE is already running. The other thing as well is that if I have a mistake in my plugin and I install it directly into the same instance of the IDE that I'm writing in, then I'll crash the instance of the IDE that I'm writing in. And of course, I can't debug it. What I'm going to do instead is to install it into a separate instance of the IDE. So you may already know, but in the Start menu, there is an item here called the RAD Studio command prompt, and that starts a normal command prompt window, but it's set up with all the paths and everything that you need to access your RAD Studio utilities. So I have that here, and I can just run bds.exe, and that will start a copy of the IDE. What I'm actually going to do, though, is use a particular command line flag, -r, and this sets the IDE up to use a separate location in the registry. And this means that I can have two instances of the IDE, and they're going to be loading all of their settings from different parts of the registry, so they're completely isolated. And so when I start bds-r-foo, it'll create that new registry key, and it'll be completely blank as though I just installed the IDE. And it means that I can basically keep my development plugin environment and my sort of testing and debugging environment completely separate. So let's do that, and let's run BDS. And it will just take a moment to load. Now I'll show you in a moment the registry keys that it creates. You can see how this works. But let's just let it start up. I'm sure it was a lot faster last night. By the way, we changed the splash screen in 11.3 to be a bit more vivid and colorful, and I quite like this one, the orange version. All right, So as you can see, it's shown the start dialog, the welcome dialog, as though this is a completely new install, because to the IDE it is. It had no settings before. So I'll just get past that. Now, if I look at the registry, and I'll just refresh this, the settings are kept in HK current user, software, Embarcadero. And normally there's a BDS folder and then the versions, such as 22. So this BDS 22 is the registry key that's used for my normal IDE. But you'll notice that we have a foo folder here and foo 22. And the reason it's foo is because I used -r foo, and that specifies the name of the registry key. Anyway, so we have this other copy of the IDE that is running completely separately. We should install the package. Now, the first thing is you need to know where it is. Now, we added something in 11.3 that makes this a little easier, because sometimes the output of a project can be hard to find, especially if you've configured various paths and so forth. So I can just right-click the build configuration and click Show in Explorer, and it will show me exactly where the output is, and this works for your XC projects as well. So I'm just going to right-click. Let me see. I'll just copy the path, actually, the folder. Alrighty, and I will just install a package. Add that. And find the package. And there we go, that's installed. So what I'm now going to do is to restart the IDE so that we can see the splash screen item. Now, I could just directly start the IDE, but I'm going to show debugging as well. So I'm going to show the parameters, and we want to run BDS with the same key. And so now when I run the package, we'll actually start the IDE itself. Oops, I need to give the full path to the IDE for, some reason. Oops, the wrong window. Sorry for early morning here, not fully together. Okay, so the full path to BDS shouldn't have to do that. I'm not sure why. Now, I placed a breakpoint in the register method as well, so hopefully we'll hit that. So we're now debugging Delphi under Delphi, and the second instance of Delphi is using the second registry key, as we saw earlier. So it's loading all the various packages. Ours will be loaded right at the end. There are a number of ways to register a package to be loaded in the IDE, by the way. If you distribute a package, then you would normally add that manually to the registry, and a couple of different keys where you can do that. Installing it via the component menu is probably not really the right way to do it, but it works for this demo. So let's wait while that loads. Things are always slower when you give a demo. Okay, so it's loading our package. And that's not normally slow, but sometimes it can be when you have debug info and so forth. So for in development, a pause here is normal. Okay, so our package has been loaded, and we're now debugging Delphi under Delphi, and you can see we hit a breakpoint. And what I just want to show briefly is that we have a splash screen item. So you can see here below C Builder and Delphi, we have the icon that I created with the title Hello ADUG. So that's using the splash screen code that we saw earlier. And we can just debug here as normal. So if I just step into that, You can see that it supports the messages service, and then I'll add a title message, for example. So I'll just go ahead and run that because there's no particular reason to debug this at the moment. I just want to show how that works. So what we should see when the IDE opens are two things. So first of all, the splash screen, which we'll just saw. But second, if we go to the messages view, we'll have a message here saying hello. And that came from our plugin. All right, so let's terminate this. And we will go back to these slides. Okay, so this showed a few things basically. What you just saw was the use of creating a package and implementing a few different interfaces. I'm going to do one more thing in our empty plugin, which is to introduce you to the final concept that you need to know. And this is it. Once you know this one, you're ready. You can just create any plugin you want. And that concept is a notifier. Now, a notifier, pardon me, a notifier is an object that provides events when something happens. So they're objects that implement an interface that's defined in ToolsAPI. ToolsAPI.has usually. You register them. And then when something happens, the IDE will call the appropriate method in that object. So we don't have event-based programming with event handlers as such when writing a plugin, but you just create objects, implement interfaces, and you'll have those interface methods called. Alrighty, so I'll just go and do that very quickly. Okay. So I'm going to add a new class here. Oops. A T theming notifier. Now, a T notifier object is a very basic sort of implementation. It's just descended from T interfaced object and implements these particular methods from IOTA notifier. So the same way you had IOTA wizard, that's the base wizard interface. IOTA notifier is the base notifier interface. And you usually don't really want to have to worry about these methods. So you can inherit from this particular object, and that has some empty implementations of these for you. However, what we're interested in is this particular interface here, Inter-Theming Services Notifier. You might spot the naming is slightly different. So there's IOTA and INTA. And IOTA is the Open Tools API, and NTA is the native Tools API. And anything that relies on the VCL is called native. So anything that's generic and that we could, in theory, reuse these interfaces for some theoretical cross-platform IDE in future will have an OTA prefix, and anything that's closely tied to a specific Windows VCL implementation will have the N prefix. Now, the theming services notifier will let us know when the IDE theme is about to change and when it is changed, and because the IDE is written in the VCL, that's why it counts as native. So we have these two methods here, changing theme and changed theme. So changing is when it's about to happen, and changed is when it has happened. Okay, now I need to register. I'll fill in these methods later, but I need to register this notifier. So I'm going to do that by adding something here. Okay, so when you register a notifier, it will give you an index back, and that's sort of your ID, and you'll use that to unregister it later. And you need to track this. You need to track the lifetime of your notifiers and remove them when your plugin dies, or potentially remove them when you're not interested in being told about the particular events anymore. So in the constructor here, I'm going to register this notifier. And you can see the code here looks really similar to what we've seen before. We're querying ball and IDE services. In this case, there's an interface, the IDE theming services. This one is more generic. It's not tied to anything particularly VCL-ish. And so I get an instance of that and call add notifier and an instance of my notifier class. And I store the index away. And I need to unregister that later. So I'll do that in the destructor. And again, I get my instance of the theming services and then remove the notifier by the index that we have. You might wonder how you know about things like IOTA, IDE theming services and so forth. And the answer is, I think in this particular one, actually, we do have documentation. But for the majority of things, just scan through toolsapi.paz. There's a lot of comments and interesting interfaces there, and you can basically find pretty much anything you need. Anyway, I want to demonstrate using these. So for the actual notifier methods, okay, so we're going to be notified both when the theme is about to be changed and then when it is changed. So first of all, I'll get the current theme name. Again, I'm querying ball and IDE services. Look, I know it implements this interface, so I'm not really going to query and have an if-then. Anyway, the current theme name is exposed by IOTA IDE theming services active theme. And then I can just display a message box with that. Now I will need to add something to the users clause for that. Where is my users clause? Oops, and I should put that before VCL.graphics because of the bitmap types. All right, hopefully it's happy with that. And look, I'm just going to put very similar code in when the theme is actually changed. So when the theme is changed, it will just basically do exactly the same thing. And it's going to print two different messages. All right, so let's compile that. Now, it is slightly faster to run the IDE directly rather than load it while debugging, so I'm going to do that. And if you want to debug, unless you want to debug startup or initialization, I often do this and then use run attach to process to attach to the second IDE instance once it's started, and then do something to trigger whatever my plugin is doing, and then it will have loaded. So we saw the splash screen that it was there, and we registered a notifier for when the theme changed. Now, notice this plugin is still very basic. It doesn't have any UI or menu items or anything, but the code is there and it's running. So you see what happens when I change the theme. So I change it from light to dark. I get a message box. The theme is about to be changed. The previous theme is light, and this is because my notify method has been called. And then the IDE is changing. Believe it or not, although it hasn't redrawn yet, it has now changed. IDE theme has been changed to dark. If you had any code right now that queried the theme info, and you can actually get the VCL theme itself, for example, the IDE is using, you'd get the dark one, and click OK in it, and it changes. All right. So let's go back to the slides. Would you mind telling me how much time I have left, please?
You've got time till 4 p.m. That means another 37 minutes.
Oh, excellent. Okay. So I want to cover what you've just seen. So you've seen creating a package, and you've seen using ball and IDE services to get an interface, in that case for the messages view. And as a reminder, most plugin interactions starts with ball and IDE services. We also use splash screen services to add a splash item. And we also saw using a separate registry key to keep your development plugins separate. See, you have also seen, I'll just go back a slide. You've also seen registering a notifier, so you've been introduced to the concept of notifiers. And once you know these things, you basically need to know three things. There's ball and IDE services, there's interfaces that you get from the IDE or that you implement, and there are notifiers. And once you know those three things, you're set. There's really nothing much more to creating plugins than that knowledge. the main thing, of course, is to find out what interfaces you have. So the main file is ToolsAPI.paz, but the ToolsAPI folder actually contains 41 different files, and a lot of these are things for various design time editors and so forth. We have recently added 2 new ToolsAPI files, toolsapi.welcomepage.paz and .editor.paz. Now, I'll actually be using the editor one in a moment. The welcome page one allows you to write plugins for the welcome page. So when you have the welcome page, you'll notice that it starts up with a pane that shows your recent projects and a pane that lists the types of projects you can create and your YouTube feed and stuff from Get It and so forth. You can create your own content there. It's very flexible and very customizable. Actually, you aren't even constrained, for example, to looking the way ours do and having the same sort of title section or anything. But you can if you want. So you can create any content you want there at all. And we added that because we hope it's useful for people to be able to create content that is useful for them when they first start the IDE. Some of that might be I don't know, someone might create a blog feed or something, or I have seen a plugin that someone created that replaced our recent list to add folders for the recent files, that kind of thing. So let's explore ToolsAPI.paz a little. So now, ToolsAPI.paz is a very large file because the majority of the interfaces that you want are here. You can see it's 10,000 lines long already. And it has a reasonable amount of XML doc, which is good because when you're using the IDE and you hover your mouse over something, you'll get this information. But we can just browse through and find things. Now, the general way that interfaces are created is we often extend interfaces if we create or add new functionality. So we always have a generic interface name. This one here is IDE Wait Dialog Services, and the Wait Dialog is the small little progress dialog that opens when you open a project, for example. It's very small, about that big, and has a little spinner, and it says you're opening your project group, whatever. And you can show that as well. If you do something that takes some time in your plugin, why not use the IDE's own way of showing progress? But you can see that it implements from something with the same name but with a version number, and that's where the methods are actually defined. And what would happen is that if we wanted to extend the wait dialog in future, we would create a new interface, IDE Wait Dialog Services, let's say 290, that inherits from this, and then the main one that is not versioned would change the version number that it inherits from. This is useful to know for 2 reasons. First of all, you should always almost always just use the generic interface name, unless you specifically want to test for something that was created in a specific IDE version. But it's also worth knowing that sometimes you have to read several interfaces to see behavior that has been extended or added or modified over time. So you can just scroll through here, and there's all sorts of things. There's version control services you can see on screen. There's, what do we have here? IDE Insight. So if you want to add something to IDE Insight, use this. You can see this is versioned as well. Let's see what else we have. More stuff for IDE Insight. What's this? Oh, yes, Code Insight. So you can add your own implementation of code completion if you want to. In fact, there are 2 ways to do that now. So before 10.4, I think, when we introduced Delphi LSP, we used one particular set of interfaces. Delphi LSP changed the way that worked so radically because it's asynchronous, and the old interface was a synchronous API, that we have a new asynchronous API as well, but we still support both. So you can add your own Code Insight if you want. So hopefully lots of this looks interesting. Let's see what we have here. More Code Insight. Oh yes, editor view services. You can do things like close an editor view. You can register editor views and subviews. So a view for the editor is something like the history tab. So you have code and design and history, and then you might have other tabs, and those are views that you can add. So if you want to add a custom editor, for example, for some particular type of file, then you can do that here. Let's see what else we have. Subviews, which we'll get onto. Here we go. More on editor services. You can get the edit options. Now I'll go into what the editor provides later. I'm really scrolling through and spotting things that look interesting. Let's see. IOTA services is a good one. It has sort of like a general mishmash of all sorts of things. You can see here that you get the startup directory, or you can query if a particular file name is a project or project group, and you can get the app data directory. You can see here how this has expanded over time. IOTA services 70 was introduced many years ago, and then it was extended in version 10. These version numbers are documented on the help. I can't remember what correlates to what exactly, but I mean, let's say version 10 could be, I don't know, Delphi 2005 or something, and extended, with a new method later and again later. So this is an example of how we sort of keep on extending these interfaces. But of course, you will just have a variable of type IOTA services, and it will give you all of these methods. Let's see what else we have. Oh yes, things to do with custom dockable forms. I won't show that today, but there are a couple of ways to add custom content, like the projects view or the palette here. You can have a dockable form. Let's see what else we have. Oh yes, you can have your own custom toolbars, and then there are methods here to stream them, because the content of a toolbar can be changed and edited. You can also define your own custom toolbars. What else do we have? Oh yes, messages. So there are message groups, but I'm just going to scroll here to message services. This is the one we used earlier, and I just added a title message. But you can see, for example, there's a whole bunch of different methods for things that you can add. Now you can get notifiers about messages as well. And you can add a message group, which ends up as a tab in the messages view. Now you can add a custom message, and the message is fully defined by you when you implement this interface, and you'll pass a little object that represents the message. And you can actually have messages that you paint completely yourself. I'll stop going through ToolsAPI IDE in a moment, but I just want to show you how much stuff there is here. Look, there's a process notifier, so you can register an instance of this, and then your plugin will be notified. So you register this for a particular process, so you'll have to get the process first, and then you'll be notified when a thread is created or destroyed, or a module is created or destroyed within the process. So you can start interacting with the debugger while the IDE debugs. Let's see what else we have. There's an interface here that represents a thread, for example. And in that, you can do things like evaluate expressions. So this is the same as the evaluate modify dialog, calls into the same code. Anyway, I'll stop now sort of going through ToolsAPI.paz, but hopefully you can see just how much is here. And I've only scrolled halfway up, a mere 5,000 lines, and picked a few things out of those 5,000 lines to show you. All right. So I have this slide here on what you can do, and we covered a bit of this already, but just very quickly, you can add dockable windows, and you can add editor views like the history view, which we saw. You can manipulate projects, so the contents of a project, obviously iterate what files are in there, but you can manipulate that as well in the project settings. You can add a page to the options dialog. You can add menu items. You can interact with debugging. You can read and write code from the code editor. You can create syntax highlighters, and there's an awful lot more. Things that you can't do yet, you can add an options dialog page, but we haven't yet got an interface to add the project options page. Second, adding a new personality. Look, there is an API for this, but it's not fully, and gets a bit complicated, it's not really fully supported. The personality is a whole set of a language, so Delphi and C++ Builder are personalities in the IDE. However, there are some APIs around this that, if you're interested, are worth digging into. And we get questions sometimes if we can replace the debugger, so we can sort of keep a Delphi project, but then set it up to use a different debugger. We currently can't do that yet. So you can access debugging as we actually saw some of that. You can't sort of set the IDE to use, provide a different debugger implementation, because the IDE is currently coded to use specific debuggers for specific languages and platforms. And you can't add to the editor context menu. So you can add to most menus. You can add, for example, to the project's right-click menu. You can add to the IDE main menu and so forth. But if you right-click in the editor, however, there are some hacks to do that already. So you have probably seen plugins that add to the IDE editor context menu. And although we don't talk about stuff that's coming, is a fairly obvious lack. So that is possibly coming soon. Because one of the things we're trying to do is really add official ways to do things that currently people achieve with hacks. Hacking into the IDE can cause issues with stability and so forth. So we are trying to, bit by bit, flesh out anything that you can't do in the ToolsAPI. But as you can see, there's not much that you can't do. Pretty much every other part of the IDE is supported. But, pardon me. Okay, now I'll get on to something else, which is painting in the code editor, and this is stuff we added in 11.3. Now, in the past, painting in the code editor was not supported through the ToolsAPI, and you had to use hacks, and they were really bad hacks. Hooking methods, poking into memory and finding a method, and patching it in memory to go to a separate implementation. Is terrible. And a few years ago, a very minimal painting support was added where you could get a canvas. But that was it. There's no information about what's on screen, so you still had to implement lots of hacks to sort of query about what was on the editor where, in order to know where to paint whatever you wanted to paint. And hacks like these are a big source of instability in the IDE. For example, in 11.2, one of the stability bugs that we fixed, it wasn't actually a bug in the IDE. It was a bug exposed by a plugin, and the plugin had located a particular method in memory and was calling it, and the method was not set up to be called at that particular time. Now we fixed that so it didn't crash because it was a very popular plugin. But we want to avoid that kind of thing being necessary. We don't want to have to fix bugs that are caused by plugins. But the thing is, the plugin had to do it, which is why we fixed it. But what we really want to do is to provide an official API so the plugins can do the right thing rather than hack into the IDE. And editor painting was the most obvious gap here because it's so useful to be able to paint on the editor, and we had so little support for it, and so many interesting and terrible hacks were required. So in 11.3, we added a very comprehensive editor API. It's not just for painting. I'm going to show you painting because it's visual, but you can query a lot of information. And it's such a good API that we actually moved some of our own editor painting to use it as well, which is nice because it's good to use the APIs you provide. A lot of the IDE is written using the ToolsAPI, by the way. So when you use the ToolsAPI, you're using the same interfaces that we do. We also got some performance improvements in painting in the editor through this API as well. Now, before explaining this, I want to go through some concepts. So let's suppose that you have one file, something.paz, and it's open in two different tabs. You have two editor windows. So you open it and then right-click to the tab and set New Edit Window. Now, both of those files both of those edit windows represent the same file. So if you type into one window, you will see what you typed in the other window. The way this works is that the IDE has one editor buffer, and that represents the content of the file. And then there are views over that buffer. And a view represents how that buffer is displayed, such as, for example, when a region is collapsed or expanded. The content is still the same, and the content is the buffer, but the view over that buffer is different. And then there is an editor window, and there's a one-to-one relationship between an editor and a view. Going through this fairly fast, it's just sort of a background, and I hope that makes sense. Now, we already had some useful APIs for the code editor about reading and writing code. So you can read and write text already by getting an IOTA source editor. This is one of the things you'll have to navigate a few interfaces to get, because you'll find a particular module and then which represents a file, and then get a source editor for it and so forth. However, once you have an interface representing this, you can create a reader, and that will give you an interface that represents something that can read from a file. And you can create writers as well. So you can have just a writer or an undoable writer, and the undoable writer will hook into Control-Z. And a few other interfaces as well, like OTA position and edit block, and they let you edit like the editor. So actions like inserting a block or something like that. It sort of represents some of the primitives about how the editor window interacts. But I'm going to go through that fairly quickly just to let you know that they are there. The readers and writers present a stream-like, file-like interface for the content. Now, this is great because it's quite easy to code against, but it can be a little slow if you have a really large file. So again, don't promise something that's coming in a future release, but we are, let's say, highly interested in creating some much more low-level, much more performant ways to access source code. They would correspondingly be a lot more dangerous to use. So you have to make sure you do it correct, but they would be a lot faster. All right, so in 11.3, we added the new ToolsAPI.editor.pas. You'll notice that we have started putting things in new units, because 10,000 lines in ToolsAPI.pas was enough. It lets you do a lot of things. It lets you enumerate, iterate all the editor windows. All the editors. You can have events, a notifier for when a particular editor is resized and scrolled, regions are expanded and collapsed, painting, and these paint events through a notifier, how you implement custom painting. You can create information about the font and the colors and the gutter size. You can convert between editors and views. Remember, I mentioned editors and views and buffers. There are interfaces, of course, for buffers and views and so forth. Add the notifiers. You can focus an editor. You can query editor state. Now, this is really key because I'll get to that in a moment. Something that we also added in 11.3 was able to register some gutter space. So you have the gutter on the left-hand side of the editor, where you have your line numbers and your breakpoints and so forth. What if you want to show something there, like you want to add a plugin that shows some information per line? So you can actually now register your own space in the gutter, and the gutter will get wider by a few pixels, and you can draw whatever you want there. Now, editor state for any editor includes things like what lines are visible, the top range and bottom range of what's displayed, and of course you can scroll left and right as well, so you want that. What lines are collapsed. In the IDE, this is called elision, so some lines are elided when they are collapsed. Now, from these bits, you now know immediately what is on screen and where. And you can also get the view. You can convert between pixel and character coordinates, and then you can query state for each line. So you can see this is actually quite a lot of information. This is everything you need to know exactly what is on screen where, including scrolling and things being expanded and collapsed and so forth. And for the line states, You can query if a line is elided or not, that's collapsed or not. Find where it is on screen in a nice useful rectangle you can use for painting. And you can also get the line text. And this is just a handy, quick way to get text that is more easy, I think, than trying to create one of the reader interfaces. Pardon me, that I showed earlier. I won't get into this, but we have line numbers and logical line numbers. And the difference between those is only pertinent when lines are collapsed. So the editor will always paint from top to bottom in lines, but it will skip some line numbers when they are collapsed. So we have two different line indexes that are exposed in the editor state, and you can convert between them, representing basically what's on screen versus the actual source code. I'm not going to show any of that today because it gets quite complex, but that's the interfaces that we had in 11.3. So I want to demo these now. So if I might have 15 minutes left, is that correct?
Yes, but we also would like to have a few questions at the end. So if you could leave maybe
all right.
5 to 10 minutes for question. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, I'll try and go through this very quickly then. Okay, so I have there are a number of demos, and they are on our GitHub. So github.com/Embarcadero, and then there's a folder called RAD Studio 11 demos, and then you go into that Object Pascal ToolsAPI editor demos. So you can download the code that I'm about to show you right now from there. Interestingly, we put those demos up a few weeks before we released 11.3, and no one noticed. So this is an example plugin, and you can now recognize what it is. You can see immediately, hey, there's a register method, and I have a wizard here, and I'm calling register package wizard, and the whole there's a notifier of some sort. Things like this. Like I said, there are only those three basic things you need to know, and you can recognize this. So look, this one, I'm not going to go into all the code, but it registers a notifier for a number of different painting methods that the notifier exposes to paint in the gutter and to paint the text. So that's when it actually paints a particular symbol like this. And then there's other painting, which I'll show in a moment. And these are meant to be flexible enough that you can basically do whatever painting you need in the IDE. So look, this is a notifier method called paint text. It's passed an awful lot of information, and then there's even more in this context, which is another interface. Again, the message here is that basically every bit of info that you need to achieve whatever you want is exposed. So we're going to do two things. If the syntax code is a string, then we're going to paint the strings in lime. And you'll notice all this does, it just changes the font color, but then doesn't do anything else. The IDE will go on to its normal painting, completely unaware that you changed something and draw the string, but you've just changed it so that the color will be lime. The other thing you can do is you can replace the IDE drawing. And this one here, there's a parameter allow default painting false. So this will actually paint something, and then setting this to false will stop the IDE from going on after calling this method to do its normal painting. So it's quite powerful. You can affect the IDE's painting, or you can replace the IDE's painting completely. And for this one, when it's a reserved word, it's going to change the colors and print the reserved word backwards. All right, so let me just install this right now. And that will compile. I'm not showing how we register the notifier, etc., just for time. So you can see two things. First of all, the strings now paint in lime. And that's because the editor is doing its own painting, but the notifier was called first, and you change the state underneath it. And second is an example of taking over the painting entirely. So for reserved words, they're painted with different colors and are reversed. So you can see thigh, for example, or DNA for and so forth. I'll just uninstall that because although this is interesting, it's not really very usable. Open one other, which is this one. And I'm not going to show you all of the code, but basically Let's see, where are we? Okay, so the editor, one concept there is the editor always paints in lines, and it's optimized as well as only you invalidate specific lines and that kind of thing. So here we have a different notify method, paint line. I haven't really gone into what's in the context. There are different stages, so these methods can be called, here for the line, before it's painted, or when you're painting the background, when you're painting after everything has been painted, that kind of thing. This allows you to put stuff underneath code, on top of code, and so forth. And one other thing you should be aware of if you dig into this are these methods called allowed events, where you return what events you're interested in. Now, normally notifiers are just called with their methods when something happens, but painting is first of all so flexible, and we have so many events and stages that if you have an event, a notifier event called for every stage of every paint event, it will slow the IDE down. So to avoid this, you register for what particular things you want. So this particular plugin is interested in the window events like scrolling and so forth, and in paint lines, not interested in paint text, like the previous one, just in paint line. And for the line stages, it's only interested in painting the background. And that means we really cut down the number of times our notifier is called, and that helps the performance. And all this is going to do is it's just going to paint something in the background, and happens to get my Windows wallpaper, and it will paint that. So I have a custom background, and you can see even with the highlight line here, it has some code for the selection and the highlight line that actually blends against the background as well. So you can have a semi-transparent selection against the code of the background. Okay, that was a super fast run through what we just added in 11.3. So what you've just seen has been painting. I didn't actually show you painting in the gutter because I wanted to be fast. You saw adjusting existing painting and taking over painting entirely and the performance checks via the events that you wanted. I didn't show querying the editor or line state or reserving gutter space. A few tips. So use a separate registry key that keeps everything completely separate. You can debug Delphi with Delphi and explore the ToolsAPI.paz file because there's so much there. And as a summary, okay, create a package, you support some Ball and IDE services, get an interface, and then from those interfaces, you can just go do stuff. Register notifiers because they give you events. Bruno Fierens of TMS wrote a great short PDF called Extending the IDE. I have the link there, but you can find it on Google very easily. It shows other things like dockable windows and actually hacking to get into the editor context menu. David G. Hoyle has an amazing website full of an incredible amount of stuff about the ToolsAPI. davidghoyle.co.uk. You can use CBuilder as well. I can use Delphi here, but C++ Builder can handle Delphi interfaces just fine. We are looking at what we can add in 12.0, but can't really share that yet. And there's even some documentation in our help. It's not complete, but there is some there. And so that's it. So we should now move on to questions.
Yes, there are already at least one in the chat window. David, have a look. From Vincent.
So I can see, oh yes, Nick pasted in a link to the documentation on the various versions. So you saw the interfaces had things like IOTA something 270, which is version 27. And so that's documented in our help, and Nick pasted the link there. So thank you. There's a question from Vincent about having a non-hacky way to access the project tree. Currently hack it based on knowledge of the virtual tree view. So yes, the project's view is a virtual tree view, and you have to hack that to access that. That's a really good point. That's something we should add as well. There's another question. You can register actions to add shortcuts to act on selected text. Yes, so there are actually several ways of doing this. So when you register menu items or toolbar items, for example, they will be based on T actions, and so they can have shortcuts as well, of course. But you can also register keyboard shortcuts specifically, so you can use those within the code editor, for example. So you can set up and say when Control-Alt-Shift-R is pressed, invoke a particular method. So yes, you can do that two ways, either registering the keyboard shortcut directly or via using actions if you create UE.
David, just curious,
Sure.
with the Open Tools API, are we the only users of that, or does it get used internally by the IDE developers themselves?
It gets used internally as well. So we obviously have a whole bunch of internal interfaces and classes and stuff that aren't exposed, but we do use a lot of those interfaces as well. I mean, those interfaces are there because the functionality is used, basically. So a good example is when we added this new editor API, we moved some of our editor painting over to use it. So Code Insight, the little squiggly underlines, uses that new editor API that I showed you, as well as some of the other editor painting. So a lot of the IDE is implemented using these interfaces. So I actually don't see any other questions.
No,
still have 6 minutes left.
No, yeah. If you want to finish it off by explaining some more stuff, yes, we do have the time till 4 p.m. definitely.
All right. Well, I ran through to the end of the presentation. So I think explaining anything more would take a long time because it's
David, what about
pick an interface and implement it or something.
There's one other.
David, what about the LSP functionality? Is that exposed in the Open Tools API?
Yes. So we had the old and new Code Insight models, and the old Code Insight model was synchronous. So you'll try to get a list of things to display for code completion, for example, and it would go off into that, and then the IDE wouldn't respond until it got information back. And hopefully that was just fairly fast. And LSP, of course, is asynchronous. So we added a completely new API for that because we couldn't rework an old API to, synchronous to asynchronous is quite a change. But you can implement an asynchronous Code Insight if you want. And we have implemented LSP using that interface. So we don't directly expose LSP as such, rather we expose the interface that we use to build LSP, if that makes sense.
In the future, say you had wanted to write some sort of plugin that relied on parsing source code to actually use LSP to parse that source code for you rather than building your own parser?
Yes, so there's information such as the info that's shown in the structure view or in the little drop-down combos in the editor. And we are changing how that's parsed. And I actually cannot remember right now if that's available in the Tools API currently or not. I know that with the Tools API, you can provide that information to the IDE, but I'm not certain if you can query it yet. But yes, being able to query that would be very useful. And then you'd be able to get the IDE's understanding of code regardless of where it came from, whether it came from LSP or something else. So another question here is saying, it would be nice if polyfill packages were released for new APIs for older IDE versions. That would make life much easier for developers supporting multiple versions of the IDE. Currently, the loss of if-defs and you avoid newer APIs. I understand that. It would be a lot of work on our part to sort of re-implement new things for old IDEs, which is why we don't do it. Maybe for some of the more simpler extensions, we could.
Oh yeah.
Someone's tired because it's been a long day.
No, exactly. There's also a link if it's of interest for the team that develops on the IDE, right? For the hack that Vincent came up with for his tool to look into the project tree view, just as an idea on what could be done, and maybe in a future version will then expose as much new things as you've now done for the code editor, right? And the painting of the code editor. That would be great. So thanks, Vincent, for that link.
Yeah.
Anything else?
I think one of the things I want to get across is, I mean, you can see how big the Tools API is already.
Yeah.
But one thing I'm trying to do in the IDE is to extend it and document it and things like that. So I hope a future version will have a lot more documentation in the help. Even just adding XML doc, we converted, like it had a lot of comments before, but having XML doc in ToolsAPI.pass is new. So we are focusing on Tools API and we're adding to it and trying to make it easy to use. So yeah, I think that's one of the main messages I want to get across. Is sort of actively there for you. But look, we have 1 minute left, so I think we might wrap it up there. Thanks everyone. It's been a real pleasure talking to you. Yeah, I hope this is interesting, and people create the plugins of all, for all sorts of things. And if you feel inspired by this, then I'd love to see what you create.
Thank you so much, David. Much appreciated. Take the time, especially at such an early time. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, there's one more question.
Triggered by that, is there any public registry or list of great extensions or any extensions? I know about a few, like Test Insight. Never have Delphi without it. But my interest in how are there?
Good question. I don't think we maintain a list. On GitHub, there was something called Awesome Delphi, and I think that included a list of good plugins from memory. I'll have to Google for that. I think people tend to find out about them by word of mouth. For example, the replacement for, in the welcome page, the replacement that stores recent projects but puts them in folders, for example. It's just word of mouth. To find out about that kind of thing would be really good to have a central list somewhere.